Hi everyone, I'm Sardar, and we have a two-part discussion on the topic of cultivating continuous progress, upholding ambition beyond COP28. In this first part, I'm joined by Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin. He was the UN climate change high-level champion for COP27 last year in Egypt. Welcome, Mahmoud, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be discussing these important matters on climate with you for the second time within a year.
Amazing. So let's get into it. Mahmoud, let's talk about a much broader discussion point about the gaps between commitments and actions, right? So we do see that there is a gap between commitments and action in what governments and leaders pledge and what is actually being done towards environmental sustainability. How wide is that gap in your opinion, and what is driving it?
Well, the fact that we're not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives is very much attributed to your question. How good are we on implementing and delivering on the promises and the pledges? And we have here three areas. One is related to finance, which is taking the attention, and adequately so. There is another area which is related to technology, research and development, plus technical support for developing economies. And the third area is related to improvements in policy formulation, regulatory structures. You and I have been following news about concerns related to what's so-called greenwashing, for instance. And this is very much attributed to the fact that we don't really have adequate standards. But if we go back to the finance part, there will be two things here. First is basically about the famous 100 billion, the old promise since Copenhagen in 2009. And I've been getting reports during the last couple of years that the gap is closing. And here you will see two reactions to that. First, by many independent think tanks and researchers, they would really challenge if the 100 billion is really being delivered because of issues related to double counting, multiple counting, and methodology. The other thing, that even if the 100 billion is fully delivered, that is only a very small fraction of the magnitude of requirements for finance for climate. The latest estimates are around $2.3 trillion a year. So the 100 billion is just a very small fraction of that. Of course, not everything should be coming from external finance. There is a great deal of funding that should be coming from domestic resource mobilization. But the 100 billion as part of the external finance is still a fraction of approximately $1 trillion needs to be bridged.
I'm pretty sure these numbers are not new, right? They have been discussed before as well. So let's talk about more recent progress. So since COP27 last year, how have you seen the commitments made in Egypt translating into action, if at all, by governments and private sector in the lead up to COP28?
Right. I think in all fronts there had been progress. First, on the mitigation front, Egypt managed to maintain the momentum of keeping the 1.5 degrees alive by introducing the just energy transition approach. And under that just energy transition approach, there are many national initiatives in different developing economies. And of course, the famous Just Energy Transition project of the G7 with many partners, which have been promised delivery for phasing out coal, investing in renewables, dealing with the impact on society in countries starting with South Africa in Glasgow, then the announcements for support in Vietnam and Indonesia during Sharm el-Sheikh, and during the June summit in Paris, there was a discussion for supporting Senegal. But Egypt as well had developed, and adequately so, for the first time, some good operationalized program for adaptation. Adaptation had been ignored. It was actually, if mitigation was the child of the Paris Agreement, it was considered to be the step child issues related to adaptation, and the orphan son was loss and damage. So I'm happy that now there is some sort of better consideration for those two other childs, not just mitigation, as important as it is, because it's dealing with emissions, with the renewables, with the momentum that we need to push in order to reach the net zero targets. But at the same time, adaptation, because we're not doing enough in mitigation, had to take some sort of serious attention. And Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda is covering areas related to water management, agricultural system, food production, dealing with the challenges facing our forests, desertification, and dealing as well with settlements, and putting that in a kind of very much operationalized, projectized way to encourage private sector participation and more finance. Mind you, until this moment, globally, private sector finance to adaptation doesn't exceed 2%. So as much as we can really be doing a better job in putting projects in pipeline, that would be a good job. The other thing that Sharm el-Sheikh or Egypt are being very much famous of now is the delivery of the old hopes to get the loss and damage fund established. And that goes back even earlier than the first Earth Summit in Rio. So I'm happy that a fund had been agreed upon in terms of its structure. And as we speak, there is some work in order to operationalize this fund with a promise of delivery of the whole structure, its procedures, by the time we meet in Dubai in a few weeks in November and December.
I mean, thank you for bringing the loss and damage fund. Obviously, it was much celebrated last year, but since last COP, the transitional committee has met quite a few times, and from what we read in the news, that there isn't much agreement on the governance of it. Who will pay? How much will they pay? What is the mechanism to then transfer those funds to the developing countries, and so on and so forth, right? So how do you see that loss and damage fund discussion evolve this year? Would there be some tangible outcomes from COP28 on that front?
Well, I think the climate negotiators has still keeping the habit of last-minute deals. So I'm still optimistic that they will be delivering on the operationalized structure of the loss and damage fund. As you rightly mentioned, they met as planned 3 times so far. And they had as well a ministerial meeting during the summits in Anga during the UN General Assembly in New York a few days ago. And there is a crucial meeting that's going to be taking place in October in Egypt. And by that, 3 things should be really finalized. One, about the principles of who's contributing and who's benefiting and what criteria. The second is basically issues related to operations and practices to be updated and followed. The third is basically about governance, including location and whether to create a new fund or to save time by using one of the existing mechanisms and vehicles. So these matters are going to be resolved in the last meeting in October. And as I said, the history of the COPs and negotiations on climate have been a history of last-minute deals. That happened in Paris Agreement, that happened even in the Loss and Damage Fund, you remember last year, until the very last moment, there were doubts about its creation. So it will happen with more political support and more coordination between the different parties.
Absolutely. No, you're right, Mahmoud. So let's talk about something that wasn't agreed upon in the last COP. That has to do with phasing out all fossil fuels, right? That one area was really a weakness of COP27. What has changed, if at all, during the past year that may result in a different outcome in COP28 on this particular topic?
Right. Let's agree first that 80% of the problem is with the group of 20 or with the G20. This is 80% of the emissions. The responsibility there is very much between the advanced, developed, and some of the emerging markets members of the G20. So as far as the focus should be going in terms of lobbying, pushing, expecting more of action should be very much spent there. Of course, there are other activities and work that's being conducted elsewhere in low-income and middle-income countries, and on that we are seeing progress. But I think the holistic approach, the just energy transition, and the lessons from the first announcement in the case of South Africa back during Glasgow is telling us that we need to reverse the order to push the transition. Phasing out coal, investing in renewables, and dealing with the social impact should be reversed in order to check first what will be the social and labor market impact of these transitions, and to accommodate the concerns adequately. Then we need to mobilize, and parallel to that, I would say as well, to mobilize the required funding, private and public sources, including in concessional terms, to support the work. And then the phasing out will take its pace naturally with that. But in order to do a better job, we cannot just emphasize on the wrong sequence. So I think there has been a great deal of learning from that. The other thing that the crises facing many countries, including in Europe, had pushed into investments faster in renewables based on the latest IEA reports and the IRENA reports, including not just in solar and wind, but green hydrogen has been very much a winner. But for that to happen, and I'm happy that many of the countries in Africa from that coalition of countries, including Egypt, Morocco, Namibia, Kenya, Mauritania, and South Africa and others joining, is basically trying to put issues about research and development, advanced technologies, training of the human capital. And it's not just about finishing the project in renewables or green hydrogen. It's basically about the investments in the infrastructure, because many of these projects are with export orientation.
Thank you, Mahmoud. As the world leaders gather in Dubai in a couple of months' time, what will be your advice on, say, 3 to 5 top priorities for this COP? Obviously, there could be many topics to discuss, but your pick, 3 to 5 top priorities.
Well, as you know, the COP in Dubai, as it happened before in the case of the COP in Egypt, it's an incremental accumulation of progress. And the COP in Dubai has already what I call the bread and butter, delivering on what we just discussed, the loss and damage. It's the year of the GST, or the global stocktake, which is basically assessing in a forward-looking approach what we have been doing, positive and negative, since Paris, and how can we do a better job exactly in the 3 fronts I mentioned earlier: on finance, on science, technology, and technical cooperation, and of course a regulatory structure that definitely should cover issues related to standards and ESG in investment. But I have, in addition to that, you mentioned 4 or 5, so I already mentioned a couple, but let me just remind you of the good approach that COP28 is embarking on now. Quoting from the president of COP28, the fast tracking of energy transition, the putting nature, and I would say that is putting nature as a priority, and this is nicely aligned with the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, issues related to nature and biodiversity, mobilizing an inclusive approach. And last year we had the regional dimension emphasized in Sharm el-Sheikh, localization emphasized now. UAE is continuing on that and adding as well issues related to the concerns of indigenous people and indigenous groups. And actually, the other thing that we discussed briefly is delivering on the old promises. Having said that, if I have seconds, I would say there are two developments that we need to tackle as well when it comes to project opportunities, challenges, and risks. On the opportunities, there are many platforms now being created, including by the UAE and public-private partnerships, and delivering on innovative solutions and blended finance, and getting the multilateral development banks to support de-risking and partnership with the private sector, which have been emphasized in COP27 as well. But there is an area of challenge here because there are trade risks and investment risks for projects in developing economies and emerging markets, and they need really to be put into consideration. The CBAM, or the cross-border adjustment mechanism, introduced by Europe for implementation in 2 years from now, but the form should be filled starting in October. That needs to really to be dealt with in order to minimize the negative impact on trade, especially in the hard-to-abate sectors like cement, steel, fertilizers, aluminum, and the other. There are many ways to deal with that, including better negotiations, decarbonization of these hard-to-abate sectors, and using carbon markets, which should really be one of the winners of the future. The other thing is the unintended consequences of some of the green initiatives by advanced economies, including by the USA. In the case of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, these subsidies may put some of the projects in developing economies in disadvantage as far as the level playing field is concerned. And that needs to be addressed as well in a good spirit of collaboration and cooperation between developing economies, emerging markets, and the advanced economies.
Thank you, Mahmoud. I'm afraid we have to stop it there, but we all really hope that some of those priorities are picked up and considered in this COP and made significant progress on. With that, thank you so much, Mahmoud, for your time. It's been a real pleasure. Now we will go to our next guest in the second half of this discussion. In the second part of the discussion on cultivating continuous progress, upholding ambition beyond COP28, I'm joined by Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak, UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP28. Welcome, Razan, and thank you for joining us. Let's start with your hopes and expectations. How do you see COP28 different from COP27, and what do you expect the world leaders to achieve this year in Dubai?
Thank you very much for having me on the show. And so the differentiating aspect of COP28 is really hosting the first global stocktake. And the global stocktake will tell us, in my view, three concrete things. Number one, that we're off track. But, and that takes me to the second point, that decarbonization is actually happening much faster than we think. And how do we see that? We see that through developed countries already within their emissions peak, and also some developing countries also within that trajectory. We also see that in we see significant progress on science-aligned decarbonization goals. Sardar, we see that from cheaper electric vehicles to groundbreaking building materials. And so there's evidence in the real economy that there are extraordinary transitions that are underway and that are happening at an exponential rate. But the third thing that it will show us is the levers and the solutions that exist today that we must employ and amplify. And one that I'm particularly, I would say, excited about is really how do we engage and employ nature as a great ally to the solution. So nature can provide up to a third of our mitigation requirements by 2030. It can boost adaptation and enhance resilience, and of course, support the global economy. But however, we know that the financial systems of today do not see or do not engage on a nature positive. That needs to change. But we can't talk about nature without also engaging on indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' issues. Today, indigenous peoples provide a service that is under-recognized by the global economy, which is protecting 80% of our biodiversity. This also must change, and COP28 must provide a platform to enhance the visibility of the needed tenure rights of Indigenous peoples and the need for direct financing to them. And finally, gender. Gender inclusion is extremely important. We know that climate change amplifies the inequity of the consequences of climate change on women and girls and those on in the frontline communities of climate change. So it's really important that COP28 provides the platform where this dialogue is genuinely and authentically brought forward, and solutions from women and girls on the front lines are not only co-designed and co-created, but supported, again, from a direct financing perspective.
Thank you, Razan. You have certainly touched on a lot of important areas there. So perhaps let's talk about a couple of them more specifically. Let's talk about developed countries. Do you see the world leaders agreeing on phasing out all fossil fuel subsidies in the developed countries? Should the world expect a stronger outcome on this particular agenda in COP28 compared to previous COPs?
Sardar, for me, no doubt, because the key really to this is to unite behind the science. And the IPCC tells us that without carbon capture and storage, global production of oil and gas must fall 60% and 70% respectively by 2050 to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. So what does that mean? Developing countries must fulfill their commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. But at the same time, and equally important, actions to decarbonize the energy on the supply side must be met and matched by addressing the demand side. So I think there needs to be significant investment in demand side management initiatives and reducing really demand. We also can't transition out of our current systems without ensuring a just transition for developing countries. And for us to do so, we must ensure that finance flows towards that direction. There are also, Sardar, low-hanging fruit within this industry. And one that I'd like to highlight is methane. So methane from oil and gas needs to be urgently addressed today, and not as a distraction from what we need to do with respect to phase out of subsidies and phase out of fossil fuels. But this is a tool that exists today and that we need to, again, capitalize and leverage on. Again, drawing back and leaning on science, the IPCC sixth report really indicates and states that methane has a disproportionate effect on short-term warming. So therefore, it is really important that we address this issue.
You mentioned about inequities within countries with regards to gender, and you also mentioned about developing countries not being left behind. So talking about that particular agenda, how must the world leaders continue to push for climate adaptation parity and a just transition for the developing nations? Do you see, and in that regard, do you see any significant progress on the loss and damage fund from last year?
So I think we all have come to a acknowledgement and recognition that climate change and global warming is here today. And half of the world's population is affected by global warming. They are on the front line of droughts, of sea level rise, and extreme weather events. So the adaptation agenda must be front and center. But engagement on the overall climate change discourse, whether it's mitigation and adaptation, is a shared responsibility. I keep saying that this is a whole of problem. It's a whole of world problem that must be approached with a whole of society approach and methodology. And this is really the role of the high-level champions, to really engage with non-state actors, be it civil society, cities, where most of the population, global population, are moving to live in. So essentially, really focusing on how we can bring and enhance the partnerships between government and non-state actors. From a high-level champions perspective, and I'll focus here on the adaptation front, we have established a significant campaign known as the Race to Resilience campaign. We also lean on the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda to really drive projects that can help enhance the resilience of 4 billion people around the world that are most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And this methodology of working both with non-party stakeholders and governments to ensure that we not only raise and enhance the visibility of the issue, but also raise and enhance the visibility of the projects that are available today that can be financed today to help us enhance the resilience of the most vulnerable communities around the world. And that's really key.
Thank you, Razan. Maybe just building on that. When you say it's a whole of society challenge, let me ask you a rather perhaps a difficult question. If we look at the last century, perhaps the biggest challenge that humankind perhaps achieved, I would say, was landing on the moon. Right? So President Kennedy gave his famous speech, "We choose to go to the moon," in 1962. 7 years later, in 1969, humans landed on the moon. And it's been 8 years since the Paris Agreement, and we are nowhere near addressing the climate change challenge. Why do you think that is? Is climate change a more challenging task than landing on the moon?
So I'm glad you provided this example really to actually inspire us, because as you said, it took 7 years for the landing of the moon goal to be achieved. We need, and we have only 7 years to halve our emissions. And I think part of the problem is that voluntary commitments that are well underway within the non-state actors realm are not really translated into the scale of real emission reductions and resilience that we actually need. But I believe, Sardar, that the ground is ripe for net zero rules, regulations, and incentives. And I think this has been a gap, the sort of regulatory framework to ensure that voluntary commitments are met with a regulatory framework that can actually level the playing field and ensure that we all live by the same rules. And why do I think that the ground is ripe? I see this through another campaign that the high-level champions are also leading, known as the Race to Zero. We have engaged with around 12,500 members, all from private sector, the private sector side, that have demonstrated through leadership and tenacity the way forward to a net zero world by 2030. And it is through this leadership that we can provide guidance for government, that, and again, through accountability, members submit data to the UN's assessment on progress, and this can then inform national action plans. Ultimately, this groundswell of voluntary action is built around common norms and criteria, which I have full confidence it will signal to governments that climate action is not only feasible, but it is an economic opportunity. This is known as the ambition loop. So it's action from the private sector informing the needed regulatory reform that is required, and therefore raising ambition for all.
Thank you, Razan. So perhaps with that, maybe we can move on to talking about COP28 and how would you measure the success of COP28? If it achieves X, Y, Z, then you could say it's a success. Otherwise, not. How would you measure that success for this year's COP?
I think the operative word is really recognizing that it is a intersectoral problem that will require an intersectoral solution. And I think some of the challenges that we faced as a community is that perhaps things have been segregated. And let me give you an example. So you have the global biodiversity framework addressing nature goals and moving in that direction. But then you have a parallel process that is addressing climate change. So for me, a clear aspect for success is creating a stronger link between the Paris Agreement climate goals and the goals of the biodiversity framework, because they essentially are very much aligned, and they also create an ambitious loop, because you can't achieve the goals of Paris without protecting nature, without protecting our carbon sinks. The other interconnectivity that I believe is extremely important is the interconnectivity and the nexus between the food, nature, and climate nexus. So if COP can demonstrate in concrete terms how we can address our food production systems so that they are not only carbon neutral, but are also nature positive, I think that would certainly be key. The other is really to be inspired by what the Africa Climate Summit said very front and center, which is really looking at the climate change urgently, because like I said before, we are already facing the impacts of climate change, but at the same time, really seeing it as an opportunity to unlock economic development and progress and support sustainable development goals, and not really see it as one that hampers progress.
Thank you, Razan. And if you could maybe answer within under a minute, what advice would you give to governments, world leaders, and other stakeholders to keep the momentum on climate action beyond COP28?
Essentially, to enhance collaboration and innovation between government and non-state actors. This really will be the heart of will be at the heart of the shift that is required. I will also stress again on the connectivity between ending nature loss by 2030 and as well as reaching a net zero emissions by 2050.
Thank you, Razan. With the hope that COP28 achieves significant milestones in the climate action journey, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure and an insightful discussion. Thank you so much.